Welcome again to Bubonicon 2020. Up now, the writing panel, Writing 101. What to think about before you start. Our moderator today is Lauren C. Teffeau.
Hello, I'm Lauren, and I'm an Albuquerque area author. My debut novel was Implanted in 2018, and it was shortlisted for the Compton Crook Award for Best First Science Fiction, Fantasy, or Horror Novel. And I'm really excited today to be moderating this panel with my esteemed colleagues here, and I'd like them to go ahead and introduce themselves, a brief overview of your career and what you write, and where you are joining us from. So let's start with Keith.
Hi, I'm Keith R. DeCandido. I have written a ridiculous amount of fiction or an amount of ridiculous fiction, depending on which Amazon reviews you read. I've been writing both media tie-in fiction and my own original fiction since 1994. I've also been an editor in the field, and I write nonfiction for Tor.com, writing about pop culture and stuff. And I was an editor for Byron Price for a bunch of years. I freelance edit now, and I still keep writing. I've got 2 new novels coming out this year, a couple more out next year, and all that good stuff. And I'm coming to you from New York City, which is where I was going to fly from to be the co-guest of honor at Bubonicon this year, and which hopefully will happen for realsies next year. So.
Next year.
Yes, that is the plan.
Susan, why don't you go ahead and continue?
My name is Susan Matthews. My debut novel was published in 1996. I've been writing novels ever since. I have my very first fantasy novel dropping next month. And I'm coming to you from downtown Seattle, more or less, where National Hockey League fans from coast to coast will learn to rue the day they heard us say, "Really? You're crooked!"
Awesome.
What they named our hockey league team. Thank you.
Great.
Walter?
I'm Walter John Williams, and I can state this with authority because I recently added it up that over my decades of writing, I have written 33 novels, mostly science fiction, and four collections of short fiction. I also teach writing at the Taos Toolbox yearly workshop, and I am broadcasting from the greater Belen area in rural New Mexico.
And last but not least, Connie.
Hi, I'm Connie Willis, and I've been writing since the late Cretaceous. I write science fiction mostly. I write science fiction totally, but mostly time travel novels. Although my Road to Roswell, my novel about alien abduction, is almost done. And by almost, I mean like within a week. My secretary is coming tomorrow to put all the chapters on the same file, and we're hopefully almost done. And I am coming to you from Greeley, Colorado, and from a house that last week had a bat in it. So if you suddenly see something dive past me, the bat is back. We hope he's gone, but we're not sure.
And if it does come back, we'll know that criminals are superstitious and cowardly lot.
I don't know what we're going to do because we really can't sleep with the bat in the house. And so
yeah, Connie has a tragic history with bats.
I do. I actually was bitten by a bat while sleeping, and I had to have the rabies or part of the rabies shots. So till they determined the bat was not rabid. And so, yeah, I had no desire to repeat that.
I can understand
that. Okay, well, we're going to start off the panel with the ideal scenario in a perfect world when the writing is working on all cylinders. I'd like you all to each talk about your process and the pieces that you like to have in place personally to get that perfect writing session for your perfect writing project. So who would like to start? Or should we just keep the same order that we've been doing things in?
You're the moderator. You get to decide.
I do. Okay, well then we'll just start with you, Walter.
Okay. Well, I am a late night writer. I write, basically from about 11 to 3 in the morning, and which is wonderful because nothing interrupts me. The phone doesn't ring. There are no radio announcements that catch my attention. There's nothing that catch my attention except maybe some coyotes howling off in the distance. But that's about it. So I can concentrate on that. And I basically work all day towards that hour. I kind of wish I was a morning writer, because then I could get it all done with in the morning and then walk away and not have to worry about it. But as it is, I spend my entire day worrying about what I'm going to write late that night, and then I do it. And I am not a fast writer. I am just a dogged writer. I write every day when I'm home anyway. And so, but sometimes, everything really does come together. Right now, I'm finishing a book, and because I'm finishing it, I know what's going to happen, and I don't have to work all of that out as I'm writing. So right now, I'm basically doubling my normal word rate every night, and just charging off to the conclusion of the book. I'm very happy with that.
Awesome. Susan, how about you?
In a perfect world, I'm sitting cross-legged on the bed by myself. Maggie's doing something else. It's 65 degrees and raining. And I have either been with the manuscript for long enough, or I did enough pre-planning that I know what the situation is, and I know who's involved in that particular situation. And I also know just about what they need to do or to say, so I don't find myself having to stop and go back and check on how somebody spelled their middle name or something. Nah, I wouldn't do that anyhow. So I have by pre-planning removed obstacles, and the story and its characters have got enough momentum built up behind them that I am writing as fast as I can. And the only thing that's going to stop me is running out of ink and or paw problems, writer's cramp.
Connie, how about you?
Okay, in a perfect world, Trump is not president, and COVID-19 is under control, and I get to go to Starbucks every day and work. That was my usual routine, and I was extremely dependent on it. I could go there because there were then none of all the distractions that you think of at home, the cat's getting on your papers and the phone ringing and everything else. And so it just about killed me when I had to self-isolate. And but I now go to Starbucks in the early morning through the drive-through, get what I used to get to eat, and then come home and work most of the morning. Courtney my husband has been really good about keeping the morning sacred, and I can write in the afternoon too, but the morning is really the best time for me to write. And I have a long unbroken period. And so I've actually had quite a few really good days, perfect days, except of course for Trump, because he's really distracting. And like today would have been a really perfect day, except that the hearings were on for the post office, and I wanted to know what DeJoy was going to say about all the dead baby chicks and things. And so it was hard to concentrate.
And Keith.
I went freelance in May of 1998. Prior to that, I'd worked in an office. I worked for Byron Price, and I worked in some other editorial jobs prior to that. And part of the reason why I did that is because I really, really hate structure. My process is that I don't have a process. There are some days where I write from the moment I wake up until the moment I go to bed, many, many hours later. There are some days where I stare at the computer screen and go, bleh. And there's other stuff happening as well. I write anywhere between 1 and 3 articles per week for Tor.com, and those are on a very strict schedule. So those have to be I have to work around that and accommodate for that. I have a Patreon that I write regularly for, so I have to make sure I provide content for that as well. But there are some days, and sometimes that's a good palliative for when I'm struggling getting the words down. The ideal situation is one where everything is sort of the next scene is already in my head. I've already started bits of dialogue. I've already started to coalesce in my brain meats, and then I sit down and the words just sort of jump out and write themselves down. I've gotten to the point where I can pretty much write anywhere. There was a period there where I was like Connie. I had to go to the Starbucks to get my writing done. There was one particular Starbucks on 49th Street in Manhattan that I used to refer to as the magical Starbucks of good writing. And there was one near my house here in the Bronx where I used to live until 4 years ago. These days I can write at home more readily. Part of it is my living situation is better. I have an office, which is where I'm sitting right now, that is very conducive to writing, but it varies wildly from day to day and from project to project. There are some projects that flow readily, and there's some that don't.
And we'll get into the imperfect pieces. But what I'm hearing is routine, environment, and having some idea of what the next piece is some goal for whatever you're writing, and knowing what that is, and having some resolution, crystallized idea of that. Okay, but yes,
but I would say I want to second the idea of teaching yourself to write anywhere. I think that's really important because I remember when I was first learning to write and in a workshop, and people would say, well, you need to find a 3-hour block where you can write because anything shorter than that is useless, and you need to do. And I was like, well, if I wait for a 3-hour block, I'll be dead. So I learned, I was a mother at home with a child. And so I learned to write in the orthodontist's office and on the bleachers at basketball practice and while waiting for my kid in the car outside the school and just about anywhere. And I learned to write in tiny little pieces because obviously you can't write, a whole story under those circumstances, but I could write a scene, I could write a piece of dialogue, I could write a description, I could write a segue, I could write all kinds of things that then I would have enough eventually pieces that I could grab a 3-hour block somewhere one time by locking myself in the car in the driveway and actually finish the story. But I think it's a skill that is invaluable because all of us have distractions and problems and difficulties. Either we have a job and we have no time to write, or we don't have a job and we worry about money constantly or something. There's always, or we're sick or we're whatever. Or there's a pandemic and we can't go to the library and do our research or something. So there's always something, and I think it's really important to try to teach yourself to write anywhere.
There was one of the novels, a novel I wrote that came out in 2006. It was a StarCraft novel. I wrote that in 3 different countries and in about 14 different locations, one of which was a pub in Dublin. Because the trip had already been planned, and then the deadline was like completely immovable because it was tied to the release of a video game, and so I had to get the book done by a certain point. It didn't care that I was on vacation, so I had to spend a certain amount of time, and I actually dedicated the novel to that pub.
Well, we seem to have lost Walter, but we are in the process of trying to get him back onto the call. But I kind of wanted to move from this discussion of writing process to the particulars of the story that you're trying to write. And basically in speculative fiction, it often, just in talking to other writers, it seems like you either have your story idea or your story world, or you have your character come to mind first. And it seems like it could be either one or the other. And so I'd maybe have you all talk about what generally seems to be the case for you, and what have you encountered to be some of the pros or cons of that kind of order. So Susan, let's start with you.
Okay, this will be quick. If I remember what I was going to say, which was that for me personally, what I tend to have in place first is a character that I like. For me, it's easier to have a character and then try to figure out what situation I want to watch that character run in, rather than saying, I think this is a cool idea. I want to describe this idea and how it might work out for people who are reading it. I have a story on a novel in the to-do file that is here's a situation that I think is cool. I'd like to share it, and I don't have the critical motivation of having people that I want to run the story, as well as having a situation that I thought was cool. So, short version for me, I, generally speaking, have got a character that I think is interesting. What can this character do that a reader will be interested in reading, as well as satisfy my personal desire to watch that guy run?
Keith, how about you?
Both really. I'm just thinking back on the various novels and short stories I've written. It's about equal parts inspired by setting or inspired by character. You know, even in the tie-in work I've done, a lot of times media tie-in work is inspired by the setting, just because, you know, hey, I want to write a Star Trek novel, I want to write a Spider-Man novel, I want to write an Alien novel. But even then, sometimes some of the stories I've done have been very specifically ones where I wanted to write a particular character. For my own stuff, it's the same thing. Some have been inspired by this. You know, I came up with the setting first. And there's one, like my Precinct series, which is a fantasy police procedural. It came from both the setting and the characters. They both kind of came together all separately, but it was a case of both wanting to do the setting and wanting to do something with these two particular characters that I come up with. So it's for me, it's a hybrid of both.
Connie?
Okay, well, I used to, on panels, when I was asked this question, I would always say, well, the plot, I always have the plot first, and then, or at least the initial situation for the plot. And then I figure out which characters I want to, or I need to tell that story. But that's still true. That's how I always do it. I've never, ever, ever had a character that inspired me to do a story. It's always the plot. But I think that my most successful stories are the ones where what really started me going was, I don't want to say wanting to communicate something, because that sounds like, you know, you're trying to teach something, and that's not what I mean, because as Louis B. Mayer said, if you have a message, send a telegram. But I think more like, when I was teaching Clarion last time, I would ask my students, why did you write this story? And a lot of times they couldn't answer that question, you know. And I got to thinking that I always knew why I wrote that story. Why did I write A Letter from the Clearest? Because I remembered how filled with rage I was at the entire world after my mother died. And why did I write Last of the Winnebagos? Because I had lost a dog in the middle of another pandemic, the parvovirus pandemic. And I just felt so guilty, and so as if I had let down someone who had truly, truly, truly counted on me, and someone who was truly, truly innocent. And so I feel like a lot of times writers, you know, if you ask them what's the story about, well, it's about Jupiter and these astronauts, and no, what it's really about is that emotional impulse that caused you to start the story. And I'm sure that's true for you guys too. I used to not be aware of that as much, I think, as I am now.
Susan, you wanted to add on to that?
I'd just like to add a final comment that's really important for me when I set about to write a short story, and that is, who's paying for this story?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's true.
Well, and that kind of ties back to what Keith was saying about his tie-in work too, in terms of.
I mean, there was one of my, I think one of my best novels. It was a Star Trek novel I wrote, which was inspired specifically by a 30-second conversation in one episode of Deep Space Nine that referenced an incident. It was never mentioned before. It was never mentioned again. And based on only that 30 seconds of information, I managed to build a whole novel out of it. But it was me wanting to know, what was the Batrika Nebula incident? What was it? How did it happen?
Exactly. I always feel like if I'm screaming at the television or screaming at the book I'm reading, I have an idea for a story because it's provoked a really powerful emotional response in me, and that's worth writing about, I think.
So we were going to circle back to this idea of the story question and this emotional core that you were talking about, Connie. But before we do that, I want to stick with character for a little bit more and talk about what are the kind of qualities of the characters that you write about that you need to know when you first sit down to write? Like, what do you need to know about these people that you are creating a whole story for? Susan, you want to start us off again? No, Keith?
Okay. There's no one answer to that question. I like, the main thing I would try to get is what their voice is. How do they talk? What kinds of things do they say? What things do they think are important to say? Part of that comes, I did get my start in tie-in work, and when you're doing tie-in work, you have to adopt the voices of the characters that are already established. If I'm writing Captain Picard, he has to sound like Patrick Stewart. And so that, because of that, when I'm creating a character, their style of speech and how they phrase things is often my starting point, is what they sound like, and a lot of the things tend to flow from that. I just and I like to know little things like, what do they prefer to drink? Are they always late for work? What do they do for a living? How do they make their money? Are they, do they eat regularly? What do they like to eat? Little details that really help flesh them out. But I think style of speech is usually my starting point.
Connie?
Yeah, I would second everything he said. I think that is paramount. For me, I write very theatrically, meaning that I know nothing about my characters. They walk on stage, and I never do any of that character background that so many writers do. I know they do it, and I know it works for them. It just doesn't work for me, where you know who their second grade teacher was and how many siblings they have and everything that's happened in their life up to that point. The only thing I know about my character is that they walked on stage, and now the only pieces I need to know are the things that will affect the story. So like in my Roswell novel, you never find out what my heroine's job is because it's not important to the story. And you only get to see her old boyfriend briefly before he completely turns into a bad boyfriend, and then he exits the stage. So that's all you know about her love life or her past. You don't know where she went to college. You don't know anything. All you know is why she's in New Mexico and how this affects the rest of the story. And so I think that the main thing, though, is that you need to know and understand your character in that you can relate to them. Relate to them in some way. Excuse me, distraction there. And to me, the only way that you can really get your main people to care about your main character is through vulnerability. They don't have to necessarily be likable. They don't have to be admirable. A lot of times they need to have a problem so they can change and become a better person. So they're not terribly likable at the beginning. But they have to somehow show some vulnerability. And if they do, that's what gets people behind your character, I think. Now, I know there are people who will contradict that and say, no, you can write a totally unlikable character and with no vulnerabilities and stuff. But I stand by it. That's the kind of character I like to write.
Now, Susan, you started out saying that you started your stories with character. So can you maybe talk a little bit about how that kind of coalesces for you before you sit down to write?
I hope I can talk intelligently about it, which is why I asked to take a past the first round. Thinking about what I need to know about the character on the way in. I think that I have to know first why I am interested in writing about this character, and then I need to ask myself, how can I demonstrate these things that I think are interesting in some action frame that will communicate my feelings about this is interesting to people who are reading the story, as I hope they are. And that kind of boils down to, what can this character do that nobody else can do to solve the problem of the novel, and why should anybody care? Those are probably the two things I really need to know about my characters or about a character before I'm going to build a novel around a situation. I need to know, what is it that this character can do better than anybody else in the context of the story, which I haven't built yet, and why the heck should anybody else care?
That's a great answer. Walter, we're talking about what do you need to know about your characters before you sit down to write?
Well, because I am a very thorough planner, I end up knowing a lot about them, and I know a lot more than I actually tell people. The reader doesn't. I think you can make characters interesting by not telling the reader everything about them, but just hinting. Roger Zelazny had a technique in his early novel writing career where he would write a short story about the main character in the novel and then not publish it. But because that gave some context to the character and some mystery to the character, you know that character had come from somewhere and had done something, but he didn't make it explicit. And of course, eventually all of those stories were collected, but it was long after the novels were published. If I'm starting a novel with a character, what I try to do is I build the action to put that character under pressure so that you can see what that character is made of. If I start with the setting, what I try to do is create a character who has access to as many levels of that setting as possible so that you can show the setting from every side. But I usually start with the character. And so far it seems to be working.
That's good. He answered the question he missed in the middle of that. That was nicely done.
Thank you. Also, I agree with Connie on showing characters as in a moment of weakness, as a way to even temporarily get the reader on their side. One example I always use is if Sauron, the Dark Lord, were shown to have a sustained crush on Galadriel, and that was motivating part of some of his actions, then even for a moment, the reader would be sympathetic to Sauron.
True. That's true.
All right, so we had talked briefly prior to this question about emotional vulnerability and also the story question that kind of kicks off things. And so I guess how does those two things kind of create the structure or the plot that you choose to use in your story? How do you connect those dots there?
Hard question.
Well, okay.
Part of the
how
challenge
do
of
you
doing that in science fiction and fantasy in particular is that science fiction and fantasy is the only genre in which the setting is not real. That's what defines it. And so you're not only creating characters, you're creating a world. Even if it's just like it's Seattle, but there are vampires, it's still another world. Or if it's, really, another planet or what have you. So the trick is to find the synergy between this world that you've invented and these characters that you've invented, and what is the most interesting situation to put them in. What makes this character particularly worth following in this particular world? Because both of them are going to be new to the reader, at least if it's the first book in your series. I mean, obviously, if it's the 12th book in your series, they know it by now. But even so, you want to find the right way to mix these people you've made up with this world you've made up. And of course, you're the demiurge, so you can, make crap up.
So are you saying then, if you are going to make crap up, that if you wanted to write a procedural, then you could then build your world to support that? Or are you saying that would have to come out of some sort of process of elimination?
A little of both, really. I mean, I'm writing a series of procedurals in a fantasy setting, and part of what I had to do was figure out how that would work exactly. What would a police force be like in a very D&D-esque, Tolkien-esque medieval type fantasy setting where there's magic, and that part of that will dictate how the plot goes. Also, is what the differences will be there.
Anybody else want to take a stab at this in terms of how does your story question
I'll
dictate
try.
your plot?
I think it's a really difficult question because it's the way they relate is very complicated. But I do think I agree totally that what I think it was Keith said that about putting the characters in that are most affected by this, or who would be the, or no, I guess I'm sorry, it was Susan who said that the character who could best solve the problem, or or deal with the situation, and that should be your character. I also think it's the character who's you put them under, and I totally agree with Walter about putting them under duress. So you want to put your characters in a situation where they're helpless a good deal of the time, where they're in over, my characters are always in over their heads. They are always in a situation that they did not ask for, cannot cope with, and are doing their very best, usually without sufficient information to really deal adequately with the problem. So I don't ever have any superhero types in my stories. They're always just really struggling. And, but I think that is why, I think I find myself in that situation, so I assume that's what people will relate to. That's what my life is certainly like. And as far as how they fit with not only who can best solve the problem, but who will be most affected by this, who will be most hurt, who will have the most at stake, who might find all their values questioned, who might find their life turned upside down the most, is the way that you pick your character. And my UFO novel is a comedy, so that applies, but not, it's not quite as dire as it is in a dramatic novel. But there would be nothing much at stake if someone who'd always wanted to meet an alien got to then meet an alien. There's way more at stake if you have a total skeptic meet an alien, because that completely changes how they view the world and completely upsets them in that they know they're right and they refuse to become a UFO not just because UFOs happen to be real. And so it's much more interesting if there's all this conflict. And so I think having characters that conflict with the situation, they always talk conflict is so important, but what it really is you've got a character in a situation for which they are very ill-suited as well as well-suited. That's not to contradict anything anybody else said, but just, I think that's another aspect of it.
Yeah, I think an alternative to having a character who is sort of the only person who can solve the problem is somebody who's totally unsuited to solving this problem. Some random person off the street. Alfred Hitchcock used this repeatedly in thrillers, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Suddenly this person is accused of a ghastly crime and is the only person who knows that he's not guilty, and suddenly has to work his way towards solving not only his problem but the crime and all of that. And seeing somebody who's unsuited to that just scrambling through all of the various options can be both suspenseful and entertaining and often funny, all at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, Aragorn, you wouldn't want Aragorn to be given the ring. Aragorn knows exactly what to do with the ring. You want Frodo to be given the ring. It was just minding his own business, just sitting there wanting to have a nice birthday party. And, and suddenly his life is ruined. And yeah, that makes a good story.
Yeah, and and there are all sorts of reasons why you don't want Aragorn to have too much power at the start. He's the guy who says, we're being pursued by the Black Riders. I think we should go up to the tallest hill in the neighborhood and build a fire. And
true.
Then we'll be safe.
Good point.
Yeah. No. Yeah.
Okay, so we have our characters. We have an idea of what we want to be writing about, and we have an idea of our story world. Show of hands, who here is a pantser, which means that they just write off the cuff, and who is a plotter?
Oh.
So Walter's raising his hand for a plotter.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm
an extreme case of a plotter.
Plotter?
Is a
Is that what you're going for?
Connie's
Plotter.
a plotter.
Yes.
Susan,
I'm an extreme plotter.
Are you a plotter or a pantser, which means writing by the seat of your pants?
I am a plotting pantser.
Okay.
I need to have enough of an outline before I start that I know where I think I'm going, and I think I know how I'm going to get there. I've never written an outline that was actually the same at the end of the novel.
Yeah.
But I think of myself as a plotting pantser. And my motto is, if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up someplace else.
And
Which
I guess,
is good if you are a pantser.
so you loosely outline and you're okay with modifications along the way, is what I'm hearing. And
Complications in the plot and the logic problems that may turn up as a person is writing, those things will have a cumulative impact on the plot that you started out with, so that the characters can continue to move, shoot, and communicate, but still remain consistent with the characterization as it has developed while you are writing the novel.
okay,
Yeah, just because I am a plotter doesn't mean I'm closed to serendipity.
Right.
And in fact, that's, you know, I am an extreme plotter because I am not a fast writer. The whole time I'm writing one project, I'm thinking about the next project, so I can generally dive right into it. But sometimes I think of, oh, I should write this scene because this scene would be a really terrific insight into the main character's problem or personality. So I'll write that scene. I'm always sort of detouring more than I want to. You know, even though I have the main character arc and the main story arc already done, I still keep finding little character moments and sidelights and B plots that would contribute to the whole. So, so it's I do surprise myself.
I spent the first.
And I don't think
10
any
years-
of us would recommend being so tied. I'm sorry. I
No, go
don't
ahead.
think any one of us would recommend being so tied to our plot, our pre-done plot, that if something better occurred to us, that we would not then stick it in there. That would be dumb.
The first 10 years of my career was entirely writing media tie-in fiction, and I still write it somewhat regularly, not as much as I used to. But when you're writing licensed fiction, you have to plot it. You have to write an entire plot, and it has to be approved by the people who own it before you start writing. So
Right.
I got really locked into that. And while, yes, sometimes you can change the outline, you have to get permission first. If there is a change between the outline and the manuscript, you got to let them know about that ahead of time and make sure it's okay. My favorite was I wrote a bunch of Star Trek novels that took place on a Klingon ship. And there was one character, the first officer of the ship, who I killed. I did not realize I was going to kill him until I was in the middle of writing his death scene. That kind of caught me off guard. So I finished the scene. I then immediately called my editor and said, Marco, I have this problem. Luckily, they were okay with it. It was a minor character who would guest starred in one episode of Deep Space Nine, so they were fine with me killing him off. But you've got to check that. And yes, you have to. I always think of the outline as like when somebody gives you driving directions. It's usually the best way to get where you're going, but sometimes there's a traffic jam or there's an accident or there's construction that you didn't know about, and you have to take a different route. As long as you wind up at your destination in the end, you're good.
Yeah, and I'm also an example of when outlines go wrong. So terribly, terribly, terribly wrong. With my novel Metropolitan, I had it just diligently outlined, and then I realized I was like 600 pages in, and I was only to the second paragraph of my outline.
Oh no.
oh my goodness.
I usually have the opposite problem.
And so I did a big climactic scene and wrote "To Be Continued," and then I wrote the sequel, which got me halfway through my original outline. And then my editor was fired, and the fiction line was canceled, and so I never got to finish the story. I hope
But
to
this
one
is
day.
a great segue into my next question, which is about series versus standalone. And how does that affect your writing process? And at what point do you know that you're dealing with a series or a standalone story? So Walter, that
Well,
took
that
you by
was a surprise series. All the other series I've done are intentional.
Okay, so
But it's just because I write a series when I have a really big story to tell. That's going to require more than one volume. And also, I learned from Metropolitan, see, that if you take your really big story and you split it up into multiple volumes, you get paid multiple times. You don't get paid just once. And so, but once again, because I'm an obsessive plotter, I probably go to extremes on that too. My Praxis series, I knew what the last line was going to be before I wrote the first line. And that's 3 books in, right? That I knew what the last line of the third book was going to be before I wrote the first line of the first book. So I was heading towards that all the way through. And I think that pays off pretty well.
Susan,
Well-
your books are a series, correct? Or the
I
science fiction
have
ones?
2 that were standalone.
Okay.
They were written as standalone. They had a finite enough problem and resolution that at the end of the first novel, the problem with the novel was solved in a sense. Other than that, yes, I have written a long series, and now my fantasy novel's the first of 3. And in those things, way back when I first started writing as an adult, I had a character that intrigued me. I had some events that intrigued me. I wrote a 1 novel treatment, which I hope is buried where nobody will ever see it. And that was clearly not satisfying exploration. And also the situation was clearly not resolved. So when what became that first novel sold, I already had been working through it for the years of the unsold science fiction novel and knew that that series would have at least these many in it. And the fantasy series that I'm in right now, I knew writing the first novel that given the complexity of what I wanted to happen to the characters in this novel, it was either going to be 3 novels or it was going to be 1 novel of 300,000 words, and that's just not going to happen in these day and ages. I'm not the woman that can sell you a single volume, 300,000, 500,000 words. So I'm sorry, I'm digressing. I guess the short answer is that I have known as I learned how to write that there were some situations or some storylines that were just too big and complex for my talents to resolve them in 1 novel. Probably partially a function of experience and understanding how to communicate to reduce a really complicated thing into a smaller piece. I'm
Connie,
sorry,
how
I'm
about-
babbling.
Oh, no, that was great.
Yeah.
Connie?
I've only ever written standalone novels, and I realize I have my time travel novels, which are loosely connected, but they are not, it's not a series or anything. I wrote Doomsday Book, I wrote Firewatch, a novelette, intending for it to be the only thing I ever wrote about Oxford and the time travel historians. And then I got this idea about writing Doomsday Book, and that I intended to be it. And then I felt bad because it was so depressing and grim and was about the Black Death. And it didn't seem to me that I had really told the story of history properly, because history is only half grim. The other half is funny and amusing and charming and full of love and exciting things. Kittens, flowers, you know. And so then I wrote To Say Nothing of the Dog. And then I realized I still really hadn't handled, like Susan said, you realize you haven't really done it justice. I hadn't really gone into the Blitz in the way, and World War II the way I had wanted to. So I wrote what was intended to be a single novel, and then it got too long and out of control and turned into 2 novels. But Walter seemed to think that was an asset. But for me, my editors were so furious with me, and I had to really convince them to publish it in 2 volumes and to publish it at all, because they just thought it was too long. And no, you don't always get paid more, because I had signed a contract for a single book and I got paid for that single book. So, but you can make it up on the royalties, however.
I was going to say.
So,
2 books.
but I have learned the downside of this series is, of course, that, you know, now everything that I did in Firewatch has to then match everything I did in Doomsday Book, and then everything I in, To Say Nothing has to match both of those, and you can't make any mistakes, especially with time travel. And it gets more and more complicated the more you write, and you can get into an enormous amount of trouble, which I'm sure is why it took Tolkien 33 years to finish Lord of the Rings. So, that there are advantages to both. I get very troubled by the fact that every time I talk to Clarion students or new writers, they're always writing a trilogy. And I'm like, you might just start with a single novel first, because you probably can't even handle that. But
maybe a nice little
really
novelette.
start with a short story. But what, Walter?
I was just saying, maybe a nice little novelette.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. And see if you can do that, and then work up. And I'm not saying that short stories and novelettes are practice, or that novels are practice for trilogies or anything. They're not. They're each their own art form. But it just seems to me that it's easy to bite off more than you can chew with a major project when you're first starting.
And there's certainly market considerations to do too, where sometimes standalones are ascendant and sometimes everyone's just needing a trilogy. Keith, you haven't really chimed in on this, and I'm sure you have some things to say.
I'm trying to think if I've written anything that was standalone, and nothing's coming to mind. The only everything I've done, I have more than one story to tell in that particular milieu. Even the only standalone things I've done have been like tie-in works, but even then, that's still part of a larger world. It's just I didn't write all of them. And all the original worlds that I've written, there's a few standalone short stories I've written, but that's about it. And I just, for whatever reason, I usually have, whenever I come up with a particular or setting or milieu or universe, whatever you want to call it, I tend to have more than one story for it. They're not always necessarily good stories, but I usually, if I've gone to the trouble of creating a world and creating a character, I want to see more of them for the most part. That's just me, though. I mean, one of the things that this panel has proven is that the answer to most of your questions is it depends.
Right.
Which is pretty much true of the writing process. Everybody's got their own process and their own preferences and their own everything. And what works for one person is not going to work for somebody else. And that's what makes it cool.
All right, so we are almost out of time. I kind of want to end on a place where you can all talk about some, final thoughts, or as Keith, you were saying, it depends. What's your kind of take-home message that you hope that beginning writers hear from this discussion that we've had today?
Just, write the damn book. I mean, I always have the same advice.
Just write it.
Yeah. I hear so many aspiring writers say, I'd love to write if I could just find the time, as if time is something that rolled under the couch. You have to make the time, and you have to finish what you start. And that's the most important thing. Don't worry about marketing. Don't worry about creating a wiki for your world. Don't worry about necessarily who the character's second grade teacher was. Just write the story. Once you have a finished story, you can do so much more with it than you can if you've got like a fragment or an idea. You need a story. So finish the damn thing.
Okay. Connie?
I would second that, and I would also say care about what you're writing.
Yeah.
Write about a story that you really care about, not just something you think, and especially what Keith said about not what you think will sell, not what you think has marketing potential, not what other people are writing, not what the next hot thing is. I always used to hear in workshop, everybody was always, the horror is really hot right now. Everybody would race to write a horror story. Or this is really hot, or this is cooling down, or don't do this, or you can't write stories that way. You have to write stories that you care about, and if you care about them, then they will find an audience.
Walter?
Only do it if you love it, and only do what you love. That's
yep.
Because this as a career as a writer is full of frustration and disappointment, and humiliation. And humiliation, yes. Yeah. I mean, there's a reason why the thing that we do is called submission, right? So So you have to love it. Don't do it for the fame because you won't get any. Don't
Right.
don't do it for the awards because odds are you won't get any of those either. Just do it because you love it.
Definitely don't
And
do it for the
because
money.
you can't stop yourself from doing it.
Yeah.
I think
Susan.
I'd say the thing that interests you, find the thing that interests you, whether it's a character or a situation or both or neither. Find the thing that interests you. Spend the next 300,000 words explaining why other people ought to be interested also, and then take everything out that doesn't look like a novel.
Good.
I love it.
Walter, I'm
Well,
totally stealing that submission line.
Yeah,
Well,
okay.
I don't know if we have
I should
time.
point out that it originated with Sage Walkers. Just
All the more reason to
credit where
not
credit is due. Yeah.
I don't know if the crew has other questions for the panelists or not, but I was thrilled with our conversation today, so thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
moderating us very nicely.
Yes.
Yes, I apologize for my router. I had to reboot it.
Oh, no.
It just died.
It knew.
Put up
Yeah.
its little feet and went.
There's-
"Burp."
it has an urgency meter on it. And
Ah,
when communication gets really urgent, then it just shuts
Right.
everything up.
exactly. Exactly. So,
So, and no bats, so that's also good.
Yes.
and no bats. That's actually, I'm really grateful that this was a virtual convention this year because I just had back surgery and I'm heading into a knee replacement in 3 weeks. So I wouldn't have been able to come. So I'm really happy. I'm not happy. I would much rather Bubonicon and all of it were really happening. But for me, it really worked out well. I'm glad I could be here.
Us too.
Absolutely.
Next year in Albuquerque.
Yes.
Next
Yes.
year in Albuquerque,
I am looking
absolutely.
forward to it.
Thank you for coming to our Writing 101 panel, and we hope to see everybody at Bubonicon next year.